Hello and welcome to Spotlight. Russia has summoned ambassadors of Germany, Sweden, and Denmark to protest what it calls deliberate delays and lack of progress in investigations into the Nord Stream pipeline blast. Moscow accuses Western countries of trying to conceal the traces and the true perpetrators of the crime. This is while NATO is pushing to draw more European and non-European countries under its influence zone to put pressure on Russia. Ukraine is also continually being flooded with Western weapons and military equipment. In their latest move, some NATO countries have agreed to train Ukrainian pilots to operate U.S.-made F-16 fighter jets. Is there any hope for an end to the war in Ukraine in the near future? And will the West ever stop its pressure campaigns against other nations? We'll be discussing those issues and more on tonight's Spotlight program with our guests. Chair of UN Affairs of Ukrainian World Congress, Andrij Dobriansky, is joining us from New York. And we also have podcaster and journalist Esha Krishnaswamy joining us from St. Petersburg. Welcome to the program to the both of you. Let's start off with Mr. Dobriansky in New York. Sir, Russia has summoned the ambassadors of Germany, Sweden, and Denmark in protest over what it called, quote, the complete lack of results in an investigation to identify who blew up the Nord Stream gas pipelines last year. Why do you think this investigation has taken this long?
I believe that the investigation is ongoing. We know that at this point we haven't had criminal charges against a civilian airliner that was shot down in the summer of 2014. Nor are there many other criminal cases that those ambassadors can bring up with the Russian state, given all the poisonings that have happened all over Europe. And to this day, no criminal charges have been levied against the Russian state. So here you're mentioning a physical object. Many civil rights leaders across the world have pointed out to the fact that so long as there's a righteous struggle going on, material objects should not be given precedence over human lives. And again, I refer back to the 298 innocent lives, many of them from Denmark, Germany, etc., who were killed by Russia.
Esha Krishnaswamy, Russia's foreign ministry expressed frustration of EU countries stalling the Nord Stream blast inquiry. Does Russia at this point believe these European countries have something to hide? Also, if you would like to respond to what our guest in New York said, please do so.
Absolutely. So the Nord Stream pipeline carries gas into Germany and other European countries. And this actually has an actual impact on civilian lives. If they don't have gas, they cannot do things like heat their homes and etc. As for your question, of course, the European countries are hiding something, and it is obvious because there's only one group that has an incentive to sabotage the Nord Stream pipeline. Russia built it, and they can literally hit the off button anytime they want to. So, of course, we also know about Mr. Seymour Hersh's wonderful report that came out maybe a few weeks ago or months ago, where he says that it was definitely an act of sabotage by people involved with the U.S. intelligence agency. And of course, we know that many European countries don't conduct an independent foreign policy from the U.S., and therefore they are walking in tandem. So I think the Russian foreign minister is absolutely right in that these European countries are stalling the investigation.
Mr. Dobriansky, Russia's Dmitry Medvedev, he's warned of launching a preemptive nuclear strike if the West would go on to provide Ukraine with nukes. Is the threat of this war morphing into something bigger and broader, just increasing as each day goes by? We already know that Russia and Belarus have signed documents allowing for the placement of Russian tactical nuclear weapons on the territory of Belarus.
Yes, that's a breaking of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty that Belarus swore to the rest of the world never to have nuclear weapons on its territory ever again. So that's something that the international community will have to decide what kind of repercussions and sanctions will have to go upon Belarus for going back on its promise, thumbing its nose at international peace agreements, As far as the Russian state and what they promise, they have been warning the world that they will launch nuclear weapons for over a decade. This is a constant refrain from them. They should not be the ones listened to, as they are the ones who have been credibly acknowledged as having had committed war crimes in multiple territories. So it's for the rest of the world to keep on doing what they're doing. The International Criminal Court already has cases brought up before it, and the world is moving swiftly towards a tribunal for the breaking of the peace as well.
Ms. Krishnaswamy, would you like to respond to Mr. Dobriansky in New York?
There is a lot to say. So first of all, the Belarus's premise for a no nuclear, not have nuclear agreements on its soil was done by the previous leader, Shukeyevich, who was not elected ever, and he was quickly removed from office, and so he has never been selected. That's the first thing. The second thing is that circumstances have changed. And with NATO's aggression, and yet just yesterday I watched this video from 2015 from Mr. Friedman, who talked about how the U.S. Controls the entire sea, and their entire point is to surround Russia and having hostile countries around Russia. And they've already, and which is a threat, existential threat to Russia's national security. So that's the first thing. As for nuclear weapons, we know that there's only one country that has ever used it in a war, and that is the USA. And another thing is that what we notice is that when other countries don't have nuclear weapons, bad things happen, like what happened in Iraq or Libya. So many countries will have an incentive to develop nuclear weapons as a defensive mechanism. But the irresponsible thing is that the United Kingdom is providing Ukraine with depleted uranium, and Ukraine is saying that they want to hit Russian targets with this. So of course, with this kind of provocation, I understand where Mr. Medvedev comes from. I may not agree with him, but I understand the need for an aggressive posturing.
Mr. Dobriansky, I have a sense that you will be disagreeing on a lot of issues with our guest in St. Petersburg. Would you like to respond to what Ms. Krishnaswamy has just mentioned?
No, I'm just firmly against the proliferation of nuclear weapons. So whatever people find a need to break international agreements, whether it's the Belarusians, whether it's people who support Russia redeploying nuclear weapons, I think the entire international community is on the same page here. We would rather not see proliferation of nuclear weapons, and it is not a good thing. It's not a smart strategy for other nations to acquire nuclear technology.
I'm going to stay with you, Mr. Dobriansky. A senior ally of the President Vladimir Putin, namely Dmitry Medvedev, he said that the conflict in Ukraine could actually last for decades. Now, if that turns out to be the case, what is the cost of this conflict and its repercussions for Europe as opposed to the United States?
Well, Russia has deployed its forces onto foreign territory for decades already. We know that Russia has its forces in Moldova against the wishes of the Moldovan government. It has its forces in Georgia. It has its forces in Nagorno-Karabakh. It also occupies territory that it claims it took from Japan after World War II. There are many parts of the world where Russia utilizes its forces, not least of which the horrors that are being inflicted in Mali by its private security forces. So I think it's upon the rest of the world to finally address this. And this is what we're seeing. We're seeing in an international community, not just those who stand with Ukraine in terms of making sure that Ukraine can get the support and armaments that it needs, but we're seeing that the entire international body has voted repeatedly. The last time over 140 nations voted in unison to condemn what has happened in Ukraine, and that's the only way forward in this. It's, again, in contrast to other opinions, I'm against the proliferation of nuclear weapons. I'm against the imperialism of a country invading other countries, and I think the rest of the world stands lockstep with this viewpoint.
Ms. Krishnaswamy, if you'd like to respond to that, also here's another issue that I want you to break down for us. Washington has said that Kiev should not use U.S. arms inside Russia following accusations that pro-Ukraine militia used American armored vehicles in an attack in the Russian border region of Belgorod. Chairman of the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff Mark Milley claimed restrictions on U.S. support to Ukraine, quote, saying that this is a Ukrainian war. It's not a war between the United States and Russia, and it's not a war between NATO and Russia. I think many would disagree with those comments at this point.
Yes. So let me first address what you said, and then I'll address what the guest previously said. So obviously, it is not there. There are no U.S. boots, as far as we know. There are no U.S. boots on the ground. So of course, it is not a direct conflict. But the U.S. has overthrown the democratically elected government in Ukraine in 2014 after the Maidan events, installed a U.S.-friendly government who basically deregulated, accepted IMF terms and conditions that basically lowered wages, took out price controls, increased gas prices by 40%, and all of this was done by an unelected interim government. So to claim that Ukraine is sovereign and is a joke. Of course, Ukraine is doing everything that the U.S. government wants it to do. But as for not using U.S. weapons, once you give somebody weapons, it is pretty hard to restrict how they use it. So it seems like it's like an empty gesture on the part of U.S. when they've been arming and training the people in Ukraine since 2014, so for nearly 9 years. As for our guest's comment about alleged Russian aggression, he just throws around the word imperialism. It's not when a big country does something. It is when you go to a country and basically you deregulate their markets and then you flood them with goods and bankrupt their local businesses. So there is a very specific definition of imperialism that does not fit Russia, because what Russia does is mostly export raw material and they import manufactured goods, which is the complete opposite of what the UK did when it came to India, or the US does anywhere around the world. You just have to check the trade balances in the IMF. As for Russian aggression, that is just interpretation. But what I do have to say is, what international community? Usually when people say international community, they usually just mean European countries and the US. And the U.S. has been known to throw its weight around. For example, U.S. and NATO. For example, last year, Bangladesh decided to abstain from a resolution condemning Russia. And the next day, the country of Lithuania canceled vaccine shipments to Bangladesh. So these are vaccines that are coming from the poorest, for the poorest people in the world. So many countries are held hostage in this grand scheme of international chess. So we have to be very careful what we mean by international community.
Mr. Dobriansky, would you like to respond to that?
Just that, it's always best to get information directly and factually, not read anonymous things online. What Lithuania did, it's belied by the facts. But that's, going in line with, trying to maintain. Sorry, is that me?
Excuse me, but I'm sorry, but this was literally Lithuanian foreign minister announced it, and that they canceled shipments to Bangladesh on March 3rd of 2022. So I appreciate you not discrediting me when I've actually done my research.
I don't need to discredit you. You've broken international law by crossing into a combat zone. We know that. What is important, though, is to make sure that we get the facts accurate. And part of the long-term imperial campaign against Russia's neighbors has been the discrediting of these historically oppressed peoples and their national stories. What has been repeated today is a long discredited, but more and more repeated over the last year storyline that for some reason Ukraine wasn't able to have a self-determination when it shook off the shackles of imperialism in 2014. This was all done in accordance with international law, as we had international observers. I was there for every election in 2014 and again in 2019 for the national elections, the interim parliamentary elections in between as well. Just like to state for the record that when Ukraine does go forward, it's usually in line with the majority of the General Assembly, not going against international bodies like Russia does when it breaks the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty.
Ms. Krishnaswamy, what about NATO moving towards absorbing more countries into the U.S.-led bloc? Russia says NATO expansion toward neutral states undermines prospects for security dialogue in Europe. Is NATO expanding towards Russia's borders at this time the safest move, in your opinion?
absolutely not. I mean, it has already expanded since 1989. It has included many countries in the Warsaw Pact, like Poland, the Czech Republic, and now it has also included the Baltics, like Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia. So, and NATO is a treaty where basically it is kind of an international, so it's a solidarity treaty, as in if one member is aggrieved, all the other members have to join in. And that is a great recipe to start to enlarge a conflict. But like I said, as we've read from the Rand Corporation policy in 2019 and so on, this is always been the plan to contain Russia. And then in the future, the US has plans to contain China because once again, they feel very threatened. And once again, I'd like to reiterate that a lot of these international bodies and international rules were agreed upon in 1944 when major countries like India and China did not exist. So it is basically, the rules are rigged for basically what the US and Britain want. So we have to kind of remember the history of how a lot of these international bodies are used. And how exactly is President Yanukovych, a democratically elected president of Ukraine, imperialism? That is a very puzzling question since he is Ukrainian, but that's another story. But that's about it.
All right, one last question for both of you, if you may be brief so we get both sides of the argument. And Mr. Dobriansky, let's rewind to a past statement by U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, who said, one of Washington's goals in Ukraine is to see a quote-unquote weakened Russia. Why does Washington want a weakened Russia?
I believe that statement was that the rest of the world, and Washington in the lead, would not like to see Russia repeat what they've done here. So obviously they would like Russia to not have the ability to once again invade a neighboring country or threaten any other country. Again, I go back to my beginning statement. We are already 9 years after the killing of 298 innocent civilians by Russian forces targeting an innocent airliner. Numerous people targeted and poisoned throughout Europe. These are all allies of the United States. These are business partners with Russia, and it seems to act with impunity when it comes to those kind of events. And finally, the time has come to address these kind of injustices. So obviously, the rest of the world would love to see Russia not be able to continue to act with impunity, and that includes, deploying tactical nuclear weapons in a country that has forsworn tactical nuclear weapons. This is once again thumbing its nose at the entire international convention. Almost every multilateral, bilateral treaty that Russia has signed has been ripped up going forward. And so the rest of the world needs to know how to deal with a malicious force this way. I think it's moving closer and closer for the rest of the world to recognize it, as many countries already have, as a state sponsor of terror.
Ms. Krishnaswamy, same question to you. How do you read into Lloyd Austin's comments that one of Washington's goals in Ukraine is to see a weakened Russia?
I mean, it is obvious because, like I said last week, Russia doesn't roll over for U.S. foreign policy. So the U.S. often sees Russia as a threat. And for example, one of the major blockades is that U.S. had plans for balkanizing Syria. And when Russia came in, it has protected the Syrian government and the existing Syrian government from a lot of the nefarious forces like Al-Qaeda, Al-Nusra, et cetera, that the NATO and the U.S. has armed. On top of this, we need to be really careful about what the international community is, because India and China are on Russia's side, and that's about almost 3 billion people, or half the world. So when people in the West say international community, they usually mean US, Canada, and some Western European countries, which is clearly not an international community. And if you look, many African countries are supporting Russia too. So that's another thing. And because the U.S. has been posturing and has been trying to weaken Russia in many ways since the 1990s, it is within Russia's duty to protect its sovereignty, and therefore it will be more aggressive. And we cannot call the war in Ukraine unprovoked, because we know that the U.S. has been arming some of the worst people, like the Azov Battalion, et cetera, for the past 8 years, and coming right at Russia's border. Okay.
Yeah, we're out of time for tonight. Thanks to Mr. Andrij Dobriansky joining us from New York, and thanks to Esha Krishnaswamy speaking to us from St. Petersburg, and also a special thanks to you, our viewers, for staying.